in my case, the most terrifying couple of minutes were also the dumbest and stupid in my entire career was while still officer but with enough years on the job to have known better. Let me set this up for you. I was working the mid-shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., assigned to 13 Bravo, a high-crime area known for drive-bys, drug buys, gang area, and all-around crappy area. I always felt sorry for the folks that because of their skin color or economic conditions were forced to live there. It was between 4 and 4:30 a.m., the time most officers work the mid-shift find they get the most sleepy. It had been a really slow shift, very few calls, and almost no foot or vehicle traffic in the area. There were 3 stop and rob stores in the neighborhood that was open at that time of the morning, 2 were gas station/stores and 1 was just a mom-pop convenience store owned by a Korean couple and their 3 teenage kids. Over the years I had gotten to know the family. Kim was the head of the clan and a former South Korean Special Forces soldier. He had over the years he owned the store. He gained a reputation by the local gang members and druggies as someone not to fart around with. He always had a 12-gauge pump shotgun he kept behind the counter and had used it 3 times when some unlucky punk decided to rob Kim. And there was the one time he damn near killed a man who tried to hold Kim up at knife point, dumb move against a Special Forces guy. As I said, it was between 4 and 4:30 a.m., and I pulled into Kim's parking in front of the store. I noticed there were no other cars in the parking area and no bikes leaned up against the front of the store by the door. For some reason, KM was not working, but his oldest daughter was working in his place. I walked in and was, because of being sleepy and having my head up my ass, did not even glance at the counter and walked directly to the cooler and got a can of Dr. Pepper, my stay-awake drink. With my head titled down I started up towards the counter and all of a sudden, through the haze of being sleepy came a sound I hope never to hear again, the double-clicking sound of a hammer being pulled back on a wheel, revolver, gun and cocked. Looking up, I saw the one eye that never blinks looking directly into my eyes. It was being held by a kid I judged at the time to be around 15, 16 years old, and I also saw that the hand holding the gun was trembling almost as bad as my legs were and that he was stoned out of his mind, either on coke or meth. I was praying it was not meth, as for reasons I did not know, meth in the early days had something it was cut with that made a guy fighting mad at the drop of a dime. I slowly put my hands out to my side so he could see that I was not going to draw my weapon, and at the same time, I started telling him in a calm voice not to do s, when he yelled at the top of his voice, "Drop your gun on the floor." I remember thinking to myself, I am not going home this morning, and thinking Marcy, my wife, is going to be so pissed that I fooled around and got myself killed. She is going to be so pissed off. What came out of my mouth before I even had a chance to think, "Now, son, that is not going to happen. You kill a cop and they are going to put a needle in your arm and you are going to slowly try to breathe and then you are going to piss your pants and shit your drawers and feel huge amounts of pain as your heart slowly starts to stop beating." Of course, I was making it up as I went along. I looked at Sandy, Kim's daughter, and told her to put all the money in the drawer and hand it to him. Now the kid seems really pissed and his eyes just grew cold and his voice was flat, no emotion, and he said in a voice that even now sends goosebumps up my spine, "I ain't your son, motherfuck asterisker pig." I knew right then it was over. He was going to shoot me between my eyes, turn around, shoot Sandy and then take the money and walk away. I remember thinking, "I am so sorry Marcy, God I love you Marcy," when the loudest sound almost busted my eardrums and then exploded in my brain. I thought, I am dead, he shot me, I'm dead. At the same time, almost as if in slow motion, I see the kid's head from his jaw on up, just turn into a pink and gray mist. His head was there 1 second and gone the next. There is no way to describe how it looked, you would have to see it to understand. Unknown to me, Kim was stocking the cooler and getting ready to relieve his daughter. He saw everything from the glass doors of the cooler and had taken his shotgun with him because Sandy hated guns. Kim had worked his way around to the kid's left side, and when he saw the kid was going to shoot, he just pulled the trigger on that shotgun, blew the kid's head off. All of this, believe it or not, took place in less than 5 minutes from the time I drove into the parking lot to the time the punk's body hit the floor. That is how fast shit can hit the fan. After I left the PD and started teaching in the academy, when I would tell the cadets about this, would tell them always, be aware of your environment. By that I mean know what is going on around you at all times, know who is where and what everyone else is doing. And for God's sake, don't walk into a stop and rob without knowing who else is in the store. Several years ago I was stirred from a dead sleep at 2 a.m. by our dogs going ballistic. I looked out the window and saw some car in our drive. We live on a farm about a 1/4 of a mile off the road. Fully fenced and with a set of double gates and the end of the drive that are automatic and time-controlled. I knew no one should be in our drive at that time of the morning. I probably wouldn't have been as concerned, but one of our neighbors had just shot a guy trying to kick in their front door about a month before. But that is another story. I grabbed my handgun and about that time I heard someone banging on the front door. I didn't even take time to grab my pants. I get to the front door and open it a crack and look out to see who the heck is banging on my door at 2 a.m. and much to my surprise and relief it was 2 sheriff's deputies. I asked them what they were doing and they said they were responding to our house alarm. I laughed and said, "We don't have an alarm system. So it's on the radio to dispatch trying to figure what went wrong." They had the right address and dispatch confirmed that that was the address the alarm company had given them. I didn't even think at the time to ask them how they got past the gates. I found out the next morning when the gates didn't open at their normal time. Apparently they managed to open the control box for the gates and started flipping switches until they got the gates to open. I think it took me an hour to reprogram everything. Now there is a lock installed on the control panel. If it happens again they will be walking to the house. A number of years ago we were called to a body dumped in the stairway of a public housing building. As we arrive we shove the floor mat into the door to prop it open, nice young guy gives a hand and we secure the scene. The deceased has multiple mutilations about his body, slashes, stabs and burns. Even a bit of waffling, burn marks in a grid pattern, yet his clothes are bloodless. Medical examiner arrives, body is completely drained. The corpse is fresh as no signs of decomposition have set in. The detectives arrive and the investigation begins, we remove the body and resume our duties. Month later an arrest is made, remember that nice kid that helped us with the door? He was a friend of the victim. He and a girl had been drinking with the victim. An argument started between them so they beat the victim unconscious, tethered him to a chair and proceed to torture him for 2 days. After he died they drained him in the tub, changed his clothes, opened the apartment door and threw him down the stairs. In case you were wondering, there were 0911 calls for the period of time he was being tortured. Those apartments are very close together. I would imagine 2 days of torture would make a bit of noise. My grandpa was a police officer back in the day. He worked murder cases and did detective work in his later career. But, this late night, he was responding to a call of suspected shots fired at an old abandoned house. My grandpa tells the story something like this. He and his partner are the closest to the house of everyone who received the dispatch call, so they made it there first. When they reached the house, they found the gate through the backyard forced open, so they followed through. It was a shots fired, so they had their weapons drawn. As they approached the house, there was one unarmed man attempting to enter the house, which was locked. The man fled while my grandpa's partner chased after him. Here's the creepy part. My grandpa looks through the window of the house, thinking that maybe that guy was trying to get to someone on the inside. When he looks in, he vaguely sees someone standing and looking directly at him. My grandpa raises his pistol and says, "Police, don't move." Simultaneously, the man inside appeared to also raise his pistol. My grandpa says, now, I had never had someone draw his weapon on me. And I began to think, what if I don't shoot before he does? And the adrenaline was pumping. So, he says, drop the weapon or I'll be forced to shoot. The man stays still. Ridiculously still. My grandpa takes cover to the right side of the window and radios in for his partner, who has lost the man on foot. Before his partner returned, he pops back out from the right to try to advance, expecting the man to have gone away and found a place to hide. So, with his weapon drawn, he jumps out and looks inside. But when he looks into the window with his weapon drawn, there the man is, still hazy, dark, and pointing his weapon directly at him. It's silent for what seems like forever. My grandpa shouts again, drop the weapon and get down on the ground. With adrenaline pumping. My grandpa says that at this point he begins to believe it's a ghost, because of how still it was being. Then, he sees that the assailant is wearing a badge. This freaked me out, he said, had my partner made it inside and was playing with me? Was this man impersonating an officer? Once more, he said, drop your weapon and get on the ground, and motioned with his pistol. The ghost man also motioned with his pistol. And at this point in the story, my grandpa says it best, it was a cotton-picking mirror. I got myself worked up over my own damn reflection. And that's the story of how my grandpa almost crapped himself over his own reflection. When my older brother was about 6 months old, my dad was a detective. He got a call to go to a house just around the corner from where we lived. When he got there he found a mother and an 8-month-old baby. The baby was screaming and crying and had a huge burn on its stomach. He took them to the hospital. On the way he found out the mother's boyfriend had gotten mad at the baby, so he put a hot frying pan on top of it which pinned it to the ground. The mother heard the screaming but was too late. He said he's never heard a baby cry like that before. The best part, however, was the boyfriend showed up to the hospital. He was this big tough biker looking guy, so he had this mentality that no one would cross him. Dad, being a detective, wasn't in a police uniform, so the guy didn't expect him to do anything. When the guy got close enough, he was making a scene saying to give him his girlfriend and kid and started to get violent, even hurt a nurse's wrist. My dad picked up a metal pan nearby and knocked him over the head. His head split open a bit, so he needed stitches. The doctor was the same one who helped save the baby's life. He was so mad at the guy that he didn't give him an anesthetic or painkiller while stitching him up. The guy cried and screamed saying it was cruelty. No one cared and no officer listened after seeing what he had done to the baby. My auntie was a police officer for something like 25 years. She saw a lot of really screwed up shit, especially when she was stationed out in the country and got called to the farmer suicides. Death by farm equipment is not pretty, but the creepiest was the thing that triggered her nervous breakdown. This happened about 10 years ago. A guy had walked into a busy restaurant in the CBD ranting and raving and threatening to set himself on fire. By the time she and the other cops sent out got there, he'd already doused himself in petrol and was holding a lighter, threatening to spark it if the cops got close. The standoff lasted for a couple hours. Just when they were going to get the jump on him, he set himself alight. The fire extinguisher at the place was faulty, so she pretty much had to watch the guy burn alive. As I mentioned earlier, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, and she had a complete nervous breakdown, needed to live an inpatient for a while. She now calls this guy the crispy critter and writes a lot of poetry about. She's kind of vague, but the impression I get is she thinks his spirit got transferred into her somehow. I did an internship with my state police force as a part of my criminal justice degree requirement. During my internship I held no authority, but the internship program was a great experience and very hands-on. One appearance we had was on patrol. This particular experience was both scary and in the end very chilling. While on a regular highway patrol, a call went out over the radio for any and area LEOs to respond to a call in which a man had stated he was on the side of the highway and his wife had just shot him. The trooper and I rushed to the reported incident. It took a while to find, as it turned out the incident occurred on a frontage road and not off the highway as reported. When we did finally arrive, the trooper informed me I would have to stay in the car while he approached the scene. We were the first on scene. He also told me to report to dispatch if anything were to happen. I was intensely nervous at this point. As I watched the trooper approach the scene, which was a SUV on the frontage road with no one visible outside the vehicle. As I watched the trooper approach the vehicle, I saw him circle the SUV and approach the driver's door. He opened the door. At this point he immediately holstered his weapon and then began yelling back towards the vehicle I was in. I couldn't hear him, so I stepped out and I could finally hear him yelling, "Fo me ti brung him aid kit in the trunk." I grabbed it and ran toward him. As I approached, I could see a woman in the passenger seat and at least one child in the back. I handed the trooper the bag and saw in the driver's seat a man who was holding his leg, which was bleeding very badly. The trooper immediately began to apply a compress to the male driver. As I stood back, I realized I could see the female passenger, and the eye began to notice all of the blood. As far as I could tell, she had a bullet wound to the front of her face. I then noticed there were not just one but 3 children in the back seat. All 3 children also had got wounds to the front of their faces. The amount of blood inside the car was nothing I could comprehend. At that time I realized that I was looking at dead people, all of which had suffered from gunshot wounds to the face. I was completely shocked. I didn't know exactly how to react at that point. The only thing I could think to do was to sit back and help the trooper in any way I could. I think he could tell that I wasn't going to be any help. He told me to go back to his car and light flares on the road and wait. Eventually more Leos showed up from the state, sheriff and local. I was told I couldn't leave the scene and to sit tight, so that's what I did. I still didn't know how to feel. Eventually news outlets began showing up and I was given the job of keeping them an appropriate distance from the scene. Eventually I was able to head back to the station. I was then interviewed by the detectives who took over the scene and went about my day. That was some time ago now, and the male driver was charged for the murder of his wife and 3 children. He has since been sentenced to life in prison. The gun's hit wound he suffered was superficial and he inflicted on himself. His story was that his wife had pulled a gun out of her purse, shot the kids, then the husband, then herself. I believe that in the end the scariest part of the whole incident was walking up to a vehicle with little knowledge of what I was approaching. The trooper, however, approached the situation as if on autopilot and knew even less of what he was walking into. As an intern, I walked into a situation with few facts or idea of possible outcomes and observed a quadruple homicide involving children. My dad is a cop of 30 years. The first week he was on duty by himself, not partnered up, which they do for a rookie's first few weeks. He was first responder to a crazy man with a... When he got there, he found a civilian with his head blown off. The shooter was schizo and thought the mob was after him and shot a random pedestrian. He has tons of incidents like that, which is probably why he is somewhat withdrawn, quiet, and escapes into books and his stained glass art with 100% of his free time. The scariest thing I experienced with him being a cop was during high school. My mom and I were driving home and we saw lights and sirens at a local grocery mart. As we drove by, we saw my dad on a stretcher being attended by EMTs. That feeling in your gut when you see that is terrible, and I can't even imagine how my mom felt. Turns out he was just being treated for minor pepper spray in his eyes. He showed up to the Mary responding to a theft. Some meated out fucker tackled the store owner as my dad showed up, so he drew his pepper spray and took his ass down. He got a pretty good dose of the spray in the process. Luckily my dad has never had to use his pistol on anybody, and he is grateful every day for that. He's only had to draw it and point it at people a handful of times. He has said the stuff that sticks with him are the brutal car crashes, the suicides, the murders, etc. He worked as a detective in the Crimes Against Children's unit when he was younger. I think that year really changed him, especially considering my brother and I were children at the time.